I guess we're starting. Sorry, everybody got here early, and we are going to jam through this because we have a lot of stuff to cover. My name is Paul McCollum. We are going over 8 JavaScript standards to learn before building Lightning Web Components. So hopefully that's the session everybody thought they were walking into. Okay, great. We'll move on. Let's see. Is the clicker? No, I have to turn that on to get that to work. All right, before I begin, just a quick note that you should base all of your purchasing decisions on products and services that are currently available.
So I'll introduce myself. I'm Nathan. I've been a software developer for over 20 years. I've worked with Microsoft Stack for a long time and C# and .NET SQL. I've worked with Visualforce and Apex since about 2012. And LWC and JavaScript is something I'm really excited about. And I'm happy to speak with you all today about it. I'm also really excited to speak with Paul. Last year, I was back there watching one of his presentations, didn't have time to talk to him after, found out he was from Dallas, and then we started talking a lot at the Dallas Developer User Group. So I'll introduce Paul.
Thank you. My name is Paul McCollum. I've been lucky enough to present for the last 3 years here at Dreamforce. My skill set is kind of all over the place, but I won't bore you with very much of that. I'm currently an enterprise architect at JCPenney. But have been working in and around Salesforce for the past 4 years now. So, as mentioned, I am a JavaScript front-end developer. I work mostly in rich apps, single-page applications, and building client-side JavaScript. So I've been working in JavaScript as my primary language probably for the past 15 years or so. It was available with every platform that you put it on, with Cold Fusion, Broad Vision, SharePoint, and Salesforce. So I've stuck with that. I am coming and bringing the perspective, hopefully from this, of a person coming from outside of the Salesforce ecosystem. So I'll be talking any of you JavaScript and front-end UI developers. Hopefully that's where I'll be connecting. Nathan is an experienced Apex and Visualforce developer, and so his perspective will be from extending from within the Salesforce ecosystem and development side into what is now Lightning Web Components and their JavaScript framework. And would like to get a quick survey, show of hands. How many of you are kind of on my side of the fence with front-end UI JavaScript developers? Okay, and then everybody else, I'm hoping, is an Apex, Visualforce, and Classic Salesforce.
Nice.
Okay, cool. This is your show.
All right.
I will just make funny over on the side. All right, so what we're going to go over is the LWC tools and what there are. It's JavaScript, but technically it sounds like nobody cares. But we'll be going over what in JavaScript kind of connects with the actual JavaScript language and why you need to use it for LWC. So the goal is a better understanding of LWC development and target Apex. I'm talking over you.
No, it's OK. I think there's a massive amount of information to learn about LWC. If some of you find it to be challenging sometimes, I think that if you focus or if you learn these 8 concepts, they can help you. If you get better at JavaScript, you can get better at building Lightning Web Components. And if you want to know, if you want the slides, if you want to see the code used in the demos, you can go to lwc.tools and grab them. It also has contact information for us, so you don't need to take photos of the slides. Well, maybe this one, but you don't need to take photos. So.
Yeah. This is a good one, and this is Nathan's first Dreamforce, my third. I hate this. I hate public speaking. That's my disclaimer at the beginning of this. I am here to share what I've learned and hopefully connect with other people that are passionate about taking stuff apart and figuring out how it works. So that's the whole goal. If you get anything out of this, please reach out, because that's why I'm putting up with all this nerve-wracking stuff. All right, so these are the topics that we're going to go over today. So decorators, a dispatch event, custom events, query selectors, import-export, spread notation, slots, promises, and string interpolation. These are the JavaScript standards that we're going over. If you know these already and have been doing these, now is a good time to go out, because this is all we're going to go over. Anybody need to leave? OK, perfect. Good. Nobody else.
OK, so you may have seen this before if you're learning Lightning Web Components. And you have this blue bar at the top, which is the thin framework on top of web standards, JavaScript standards. And what we're going to focus on is this part. So these are the standards that are the framework that have changed a lot since 2014. So when Aura was released, so now LWC is the new standard everybody's supposed to use. So just a quick refresher on LWC for you if you're not familiar with it.
All right, so quickly, the timeline. ECMAScript is a language specification. It is not an implementation, which JavaScript is an implementation. If-then language specification. ECMAScript is the body that kind of took over the language specification. They've had a little bit of a rough roll over the past couple years with 10 years passing in between releases. But just want to make that clear, because one of the first standards we're going to go over, it's a language standard, but it's kind of a placeholder standard because it actually acts on the implementation. So the Lightning Web Components is doing its own implementation of the ECMAScript language. So hopefully that's clear as mud, because that's kind of substantial for what we're about to go through. All right.
And one thing to note is that Salesforce has joined ECMA as one of the associate members, and they've also joined the W3C. So Salesforce is actively involved in making these standards. If you develop in LWC, it's useful to be familiar with what ECMAScript standards are supported. So right now, just a refresher, or if you haven't seen it, you can use 6, 7, some of 8, and some of 9. And ECMAScript 8 introduces some really cool new features like trailing commas, but you can't use shared memory and atomics. And if you look in the LWC developer guide, you can see which standards are supported. So as new standards are supported, I assume it will be updated there.
So if I may, so ECMAScript, the language, is developing features, or at least prototypes for features. They are incorporated into Chrome, JavaScript engines, Internet Explorer, Safari in their client-facing engine, and at different paces, they are included into the Lightning Web Components backend server infrastructure. So what we're going through is we're kind of highlighting that you can go read the ECMAScript standard, but not everything has been implemented in the Lightning Web Components implementation. All right, so decorators. These aren't technically a standard yet. I think they have yet to be approved. This is the placeholder I'm talking about. These things actually kind of connect to magic. You start talking about labeling areas of functions with an @decorator. Everybody remember the Aura-enabled decorator inside of Apex Triggered, or the app future? Okay, that tells the compiler or the backend system some special things to do with that code. So it's kind of a little bit of a magic placeholder. Track tells this variable you're going to start watching between backend code and front-end activities. So track says when there are changes made, you may have to update the front end. So that's how you kind of tell a variable that you're not just working with, that it also needs to be posting stuff to the front end. That's the decorator that you use on track. API means that when you're developing code, it starts out private by default. And if you want to make it public so that other things can call and reach into it, you put the API decorator on there. And then @wire is for connecting functions or variables to data.
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, we just get right to the decorators. They're sort of a standard, but they're very important for Lightning Web Components.
They're only in the implementation. Yeah. So, all right.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the two standards: dispatch event and custom event. So when you need to raise an event from a child to a parent component in LWC, you use these standards called dispatch event and custom event. So one thing to note, so if you see some code here, you can see that I've defined a custom event called change. So the event can be defined, it has to be all lowercase, and I recommend not putting on before the name of the event, because as you see, it comes out as on change when you're using the handler. So if you called your event something like on foo, on Baz, you get on foo. So you don't want to do that. And you can see that the handler at the bottom handles the change event defined in the top. So I've made a demo, and let me explain how it works a little bit. I've made an LWC control that I've had the request to make this many times. At the bottom, you'll see a data table, and you'll see some buttons at the top. They're called lightning stateful buttons. And when you click a button at the top, an event fires. It goes to the parent container. So you can see in here, this whole thing is a container that handles the event, passes it down to a child record, and then updates the data table. So this is a common use case that I've seen using LWC, and we're going to incorporate the standards into this demo. So let's start with dispatch event.
Not over there yet. You're not on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
Let's skip it. Sorry. Sorry about that.
Maybe we'll do some
We'll move on to the next one because we need to get through them.
Alt-tabbing is not super easy when you're trying to read and watch at the same time. So query selector. If you've worked with client-side JavaScript, you probably remember document.getElementById. Everybody please tell me you've used document. Okay, good. And if you're from a slightly earlier generation, jQuery had a neat selector component where you could go through and do either or, but that's been moved up into modern CSS, and you can document.getElementById works just fine. Now, that works fine because when you're talking to the DOM, you're talking to the entire DOM, and document.getElementID assumes that it's all your code. When we're doing Lightning Web Components, we're assuming that we're writing code in a small area on a shared page. So you'll see a lot of these concepts come through that are trying to do security, and they're an implementation of a frame that you're putting your component into and trying to keep things from talking into it and keeping you from talking out. So when you write back-end code, if you wrote an ID equals ops by role, when it's surfaced from the server to the client, they will randomize a key number and attach it to the end. So if you were trying to do document.getElementById and ops by role, it wouldn't show up because the Lightning Web Component compiler has translated that and changed the name of your ID into something that it's keeping track of. So the thing that has the secret decoder ring is the function query selector. So you'd start using a query selector instead of document.getElementById. Man, that's hard to say a ton of times. So in place of those two, it's how you'd select it, and then it would know which one you're talking to, and it would know to go make a change on ops by role 102.
So here's some sample code. Let's say you have a greeting LWC template defined. This is the greeting, and you have this is the API tracked variable, reactive variable, where you pass in a value, and you can see here that if you have a greeting container, right here it says, this.template.querySelector, this is what you're supposed to use in LWC. This is a new standard, and Paul's explained it. So, the result of this code would show you, passing through, you get the component, you pass in howdy y'all as the greeting, and the greeting for your preferred locale comes out in the output, howdy y'all, and that's our greeting from Texas.
All right, so import-export. Now, this one, if you've used external JavaScript files before, this is really just a file source equals JavaScript file. This is just a prettier, easier to track, and a function-by-function way to import helper functions into your JavaScript code. You can see what we've just got some demos of the code here from a front-end client-side JavaScript. This is nothing more than just pulling other JS files into it. From the import-export perspective, or whatever, include Studio H if you're old C developers. Really not a whole lot to this, but it's there to help clean up your code.
And one thing to note here is that if you're familiar with using Aura components, you can use the.
Sorry.
You bumped it. Okay. If you're familiar with Aura components, the equivalent of using the controller is now you can use specific calls. So you can see import get contact list, that second item. So that is something that you can use to pull in an apex function imperatively, and then you can use that in your code.
I think we'll need to speed up a little.
Okay.
All right, spread notation. This is a fun one. Spread notation is these three dots here, commonly known as ellipses. So what spread notation does, it is I think there's some magic to it. When we went through and tried to test the code from what it says it's supposed to do to what it actually does, it seems like there may be a little bit more magic to it. Spread notation is a way of explicitly copying data from an array into another array or reusing it. So this data, whatever's in this array currently, is going to, as long as it's a one-dimensional array, it is going to put in a comma-separated list every element in that array. Now, the reason that's important, it's attached to one of those magic things. If this .data, that array is connected to something that's on your screen, and when you make a change to it, like here we're adding a new row, a new element of data, if you just do a simple array push, that doesn't trigger the front end or the back end system to send a change event to the front end. When you put it in this way, it's the same thing as writing out the array completely, basically reinstantiating the array. But with this .data, it helps to trigger the rewrite of the page. Now, we went through, and so basically it's the same thing as if you were trying to store the entire contents of the array again explicitly, but spread actually triggered the front end thing, even though we didn't, and the writing it out longhand did. Writing it out longhand did not trigger the front end screen change. Are we doing a demo on spread? Nope.
No,
All right.
but I will do the demo on slots.
Nice.
So slots is a web standard. It's a way to pass through HTML to a child component. So you'll see here that we have a definition of a component here, template, LWC template, and two slots, locale and locale greeting. And what you can do is when you use the component, you can put values inside of those slots. So you can see that I've passed through HTML, and they'll pass through the child. Now, you don't have to name the slots. This is just one example. And by calling it slot equals locale, you're specifying multiple, you can give slots different names and specify multiple slots to pass through HTML. But it's possible to just have the word slot, and then it'll pass through without specifying any names. All right, so let's go to this. Can you see it? That's not good.
Did for a second.
It's gone. Okay. This is a problem.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so this is my example of using slots.
Maybe do your zoom on that.
Okay, I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay, so I've made something that you can click 3 locales and get 3 different greetings. And I've chosen Switzerland, Philippines, and Texas. And if you look in the code, you'll see, I'm going to move this over too. Can you all see this okay?
Almost.
Oh. All right. Sorry, 1 second, please. And this will be our last demo. Okay, so right here you can see the definition of slots. So you have locale, you have locale greeting, and nothing behind there. And then in the container, so this is where I'm passing through all the locales into the slots. So you can see, if I click one of those buttons at the top, I handle it, and then I pass the locale and the greeting through with the variable. So when you click the buttons, you get these quick greetings. All right, I'll go back to slides.
So basically it's similar to the front end of document.getElementById item.innerHTML equals this. So it's basically creating a span type placeholder for you to push content into, be able to talk in and out of that. Brought to you by the least Texas guys out here, trying to say y'all multiple times
Right.
and not doing it well.
Over there. Okay. Where'd it go? Okay, so let's talk about promises. Promises are really important standards to understand. I found them very complicated. The asterisk next to thinking synchronously is me. So if you remember the .NET background, the Apex background, I expect to wait for things to come back, and when they come back, do something with them. So promises in AsyncAwait are a way to allow JavaScript to represent the eventual completion or failure of a task. And it may not be processing, it may be waiting for something to come back, so let's say a REST call or something like that. But when it comes back, you can handle the call. So this is another cleanup opportunity. So we got, excuse me. When you're writing async code doing like an AJAX call out, in the past, all you've had is you got a return or you got an error message. And then you had to nest what you were going to do with that return and or the error message and or any additional things that you're going to. So this is one of the things, I think the next one we're talking about also is will help fight Christmas tree code. If you watched a lot or have seen a lot of JavaScript code trying to make asynchronous calls out, the asynchronous call takes a function as an argument on success or failure. And usually people, well, I hate people the way they do this, but the pattern seems to be to just start writing another function within the call of that function. And if you're trying to do multiple things or one call out is dependent upon another call out, you get a call out within a call out within a call out, and they call that Christmas tree code. This is some actual structure to handle asynchronous calls and make consecutive work out of them. So your code ends up being a lot cleaner if you adopt this structure, and if you're doing a whole lot of, I'm calling out to this system to get an ID, then I'm taking that ID over here to get some other valid data, and then I'm going over here to query on the merge of those two things. So that's where you'll get really dependent on these functions as you start making multiple callouts. If you're doing very simple stuff, yeah, just go get a username and pull it back. You probably won't see a ton of need for that, but as you get more and more complex, you'll want to switch to this almost immediately. So we have some sample code, and it's very, very basic promise code. And one thing to note is promise starts with a capital P, so don't spend 8 hours with, you know how JavaScript is, right? So in this example, we're creating a new promise. Paul promises that you will have fun learning. And when you see the handler for it, you see a .then. So it's a construct that, I found a little, it threw me off at first, but it's something that, it waits for Paul to come back with his promise that you'll have fun learning, and then you handle it with a then or a catch. And then you can add a finally, which will execute whether it succeeds or fails. So there's also a concept called promise.all. So let's say I have a promise and Paul has a promise, and you need both promises to come back before you can move on to your next step. So promise.all will handle both promises, and then they'll come back in the order, so you can see at the bottom that my promise came back before Paul's promise. So regardless of when they actually come back, you'll get them back in an array in that order. So this is really useful for tracking. The promises are setting up a record for all of the asynchronous calls that are going out, and being able to point in time kind of query what's been returned and what hasn't, so you can make decisions. Should I still be waiting? Should I wait another millisecond for this to come back? Or should I assume it's failed and go down another path? And this is one more pattern, AsyncAwait. So it's new, introduced in ECMAScript 8. And it's a cleaner, simpler syntax. And it can make the connected callback, which occurs when LWC is wired up, to support AsyncAwait. So you can use it in the connected callbacks in LWC. But one thing to note is it's not recommended for IE11 because there's a large performance hit, and so just if you have a lot of people using Internet Explorer, avoid the AsyncAwait pattern.
All right, string interpolation. This is an easy one. It's been around in a couple of different languages, and you probably run into it if you've coded outside of it. But really, it's getting you away from the building a response string for the user. If you're building long strings of text and you're trying to intersperse variables in between it, you end up with these really long plus equals, ampersand, quote, ampersand, space, ampersand, the variable name, and then, I get so many errors trying to figure out having too many pluses or too many quotes. This lets you just start with your response text template, your string template, and then insert variables into the string. So when you're building one of these up and when you're wanting to use string interpolation, the back tick, not the single quote, that's a back tick. You set up that string with a back tick, and that makes it able to accept variable insertion by string interpolation.
And this one may seem really simple, but JavaScript was something that I was kind of working on in isolation, and somebody looked at my code and he said, you have so much string concatenation. Don't you know about string interpolation? So I like to think of this presentation as something I would have liked to give myself 9 months ago. One thing you may also notice is let and const. We've used it in a lot of code, and let and const is a new concept that is block scope variables that, if you use var all the time, it's worth learning let and const, and make sure that you have more control over your variable scope. And Paul,
you changed our deck on me. This is his favorite band. Mine is 9 Inch Nails. Somebody did some string interpolation. It's really bad taste.
This was a setup.
All right, so we have time for one extra slide. So Shadow DOM, this is a really interesting, it's another piece of security and scoping. It does not take you to an alternate dimension, and you do not need a Ouija board to communicate with it. What you do need is a very specific set of JavaScript. The Shadow DOM, so if you've worked at all with stuff like Node, or anything else, there's a virtual DOM that's kept on the server and the actual DOM that's kept in the browser. And the server is supposed to be keeping track of both of those, and whenever something changes in the virtual DOM, all it does is send an update of saying change this element in the DOM. Shadow DOM, completely different. Shadow DOM lets you define a namespace within your code that you're pushing up to the client, and it protects it. It lets you set up your own DOM tree that the rest of the page and the rest of the code can't see or can't talk to. It's in use. One of the places that you'll see demos when you're reading up on this is the audio player. Whenever you use the audio tag, the HTML5 audio tag, and it brings up the little play button and the duration slider for where you are in the video, you can't style those. You can't see them. All you see is audio. But those are actually made up of HTML code. That button, those are image and graphics. They are just hidden within the Shadow DOM. So if you know how to talk to it, you can go through and restyle those. What you'd use in Shadow DOM in Lightning Web Components, if you are developing code and you've got a bad front-end designer or you've got multiple design teams working and your code depends on the buttons and checkboxes and so forth being a certain size, and one of those yahoos styles the paragraph or table tag directly with CSS, the Shadow DOM would protect it. All of that stuff that is rendered outside of and through the browser and HTML can't talk to your code unless you tell it this P in this special DOM that I just made up, and I'm calling this and this element of it. So you can specifically talk to it if you leave it open. If you leave it open, you can call it from outside. So JavaScript could talk to, from one other Lightning component, could talk to this Shadow DOM, or you could say, no, only my Lightning component code can change anything inside of this area. So if you're bringing anything in, like everybody has had to deal with this whenever the HTML styles or somebody changes the style, and it renders just fine when you're developing it personally on your desktop or in your sandbox, but when you go where you've got the corporate branding CSS template, it messes it up. So this is that wonderful answer to that. And yeah, maybe a little evil, but really super useful.
All right, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of information about LWC, JavaScript, lots to learn. And these have helped me a lot, monitoring the Salesforce developer blog, the engineering blog, if you want to go in depth a little bit. There's a great book series called You Don't Know JavaScript, or You Don't Know JS, and I highly recommend that. Pluralsight has some play-by-plays that are great. And there's a Trailblazer community group I recommend joining, Lightning Web Components. And you can install the sample galleries. They've rebuilt all the sample galleries for LWC. And again, you can go to lwc.tools. And thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.